thank you. I'm glad to be here. When I suggested that I'll be fairly brief in my remarks to leave more time for Q&A, since most of you will have actually read my remarks, and I haven't invented a new strategy since Friday. So, but I thought it was interesting, listening to this history of California, and I'd say the council members that came together clearly came with a view. A couple of aspects of their view is, one is that I think standing still and not addressing your issues in good times means that you end up doing what California does in bad times. And while that is against human nature prefers to postpone problems in good times. There are issues in Ontario. There are things that need to be done, and we should try to make something happen. And then I think the second bias that the group came with, is that the perfection is the enemy of good enough, and usually means that you actually end up not doing stuff. And that we didn't take on this endeavor so that we could have another book on the shelf of great reports telling you how to make a perfect Ontario. What we wanted to do to say, how could we make a better Ontario? And, I've been interested in the reaction when I was doing all the press interviews of people saying, wow, you are the most timid group that I've ever met. And we took that as a compliment. Because the reality is, I think if you try to do too much rather than try to do something, you often don't get anything done. So as mentioned, we really had pretty wide mandates, pretty interesting to go all the way from the alcohol beverage to the energy production sector. And I'd say the alcohol beverage was intellectually quite an interesting area because we run a pretty unique system here in Ontario, a system of monopolies. An LCBO monopoly, a beer store monopoly, a wine store monopoly, and even within the LCBO agencies and stores, but all built around we create monopolies. And you had to ask yourself, well, wasn't just the sensible thing was just to blow the whole thing up and say, let's just end all these monopolies and run the place like this is an ordinary good, and why don't we just have it sold? And I think our conclusion was, that's certainly not something, we get the arguments for that, but it's one of those big transformational things that you really want to be sure that's what the population wants to do. And for a government to use up a huge amount of its political capital, and that's always the scarcest commodity for a government, is how much political capital do you want to spend and where do you want to spend it. Would we say that the alcohol beverage system in Ontario is Ontario's #1 economic problem? And we'd say no. This is a system that basically works. It's actually a very low-cost system. It's an efficient system. It does provide access points. And so with that, in our view, we said, if we were the government, what we would do is say, can we tweak the system? Can we make this system better? Can we introduce some forms of competition into the system without destroying the system? Can we have more innovation in the system? Can we turn, and it's in some sense perhaps an oxymoron, but can you turn a government monopoly into not acting like a government monopoly and have it start with the customer rather than start with itself? Now that problem of starting with yourself, not the customer, is frankly endemic to a lot of institutions, not just governments. There are lots of private sector firms that are run the same way. The only difference is that if you're not a monopoly, the game catches you up eventually and you're not in business, where when you're in monopoly, you can get away with that for a long period of time. So could we tweak that system and make it more customer-oriented? Could we make sure that the system, because it was more efficient, that the consumers got an advantage of that, and so that alcohol prices would be less in Ontario than elsewhere because of that efficiencies? And could we also then improve the returns to the province? And we ended up with a package. I don't have to get through all of it, but we ended up with a package that said, I think we can do all of that. We can offer simple things like, right now you can't buy a 12-pack of beer in the LCBO, and we say, it's cheaper to buy 12 packs than 2 6-packs. What's so wrong with the LCBO selling 12 packs? And that, in our view, will not destroy the beer store monopoly, but it will make more competition, obviously, between those two systems. Could we make sure in the beer store that the craft brewers are treated equitably with the owners in terms of the display of their products? If you're going to have a monopoly, I think there's a requirement that you have to treat all participants equally. So could we look at, and we're in the middle of discussions now, and say, well, is there anything wrong with opening up some more stores? We already have a set of private wine stores, but they're exclusive wine stores there are only 6 companies that have them. Well, what about the people, other people might want wine stores, or maybe individual wants to own up a wine store? Would that really bring the system to its knees if we said, well, then open it up? You want to open up a wine store? Is there a limited number of wine stores that we could open up to just put some competition and innovation into the system? And then we were able to find places that we could earn more money. It's interesting, the LCBO, despite being the biggest buyer or second biggest buyer in the world, it doesn't use its buying power at all. And yet we know that you can use, in our view, and you can use objective criteria to use that. And you can say, well, not all shelf space in a store is equal. Anybody who's run a retail business says there's valuable spots in that store. So why would we just allocate them administratively? Why wouldn't we auction them off and say, if you want your stuff on the front shelf and the eye level, you're going to give us a bigger margin than if you don't. Why aren't we introducing value products? So you walk in the store and say, here's our Best Buy California white wine, and if you want your bottle to be there, well, then tell us what margin we're going to earn on that. So I think there are sensible tweaks to the margin system that will give us, the LCBO, more return. What's interesting that as soon as you turn it on its head, and right now, one of our great discoveries was we actually had 3 firms, all of whom had the same system, which is the cost-plus system. That's how your regulated utilities work. That's, in effect, how the LCBO work. So if it costs a lot of money to ship a good from Bordeaux over to Canada, that's a good thing, because then I get a bigger margin, I make more profits. And as soon as you turn your head around and say, well, what if we got the product at Bordeaux and then you paid the cost? Oh, well, then I could obviously ship it for cheaper. So why wouldn't we do that, and you take the difference? So we think the organization's a fairly big transformation to say, run yourself like a normal retailer, be customer-oriented, and find ways that you can transparently tweak the system to, in fact, get more profits out of that system. You then come to the beer store I've already talked about. We want to make sure that they treat people fairly. We're also saying governments should not give away. These are not natural monopolies. These are created monopolies. And if people want a monopoly, they ought to have a monopoly license fee or whatever. And there's different ways to do that, and that we want to make sure that the government is being treated fairly, or the citizens are being treated fairly. And in the wine store, it's a much more complicated situation, but the reality is that the government of Ontario earns less from a bottle of wine sold in a private wine store than it does in the LCBO. So you say, well, why would I grant a license to someone and then earn less money? There are some arguments of why you might have to do that, but we want to go sit down with the owners of those and say, but is this, in fact, do we have a fair deal here for us? If we get to the electricity sector, we looked at OPG and Hydro One and came to the conclusion that Hydro One, or OPG, let me start with OPG, has its plate full. Right now, it's in the process of beginning the refurbishment of Darlington. It has to then shut down Pickering. These are massive projects, $10 billion for Darlington. You get that wrong by 20%, all the work we do is just wiped out in one single mistake. And having that organization do anything but work about how can we make sure that refurbishment is done and done on budget, I would say, my experience is if you say on time and on budget, you've asked too much. Most large projects are actually not on time and not on budget. You want to focus on something, you should focus on getting this on budget, and that they ought to make sure that their organization and they have the people in place to make sure that that happens. And there are operational opportunities. Probably not as big as what we thought when going in, both for Hydro One and for OPG. But there are also clearly labor issues that have been identified. The unions that are aware of those issues, and I'd say the #1 issue is the pension plan. Jim Leach has written that report. There's been a process set up. The unions have agreed. We've agreed. This is an issue that can be solved. It has to be solved together, not by confrontation, not by demonizing. I think one of the things that I find in all this debate, it is easy to demonize people. But you weren't there when the deals were done, the bargains were struck, the agreements made, and there's no point going back at that. You just really say, do we have a pension system in these two electricity companies that is sustainable? And the answer is no, it is not. And that concerns the employees, and it concerns the government, and we have to sit down and solve that problem. When we came to Hydro One, the interesting, again, I thought transmission business, basically a pretty well-run business. What stood out is that there's been this problem that everyone's identified and studied for years, is we have electricity distribution system that doesn't work in Ontario and is in risk in the next 20 years of being a very big impediment to what needs to be done. So we have another infrastructure deficit here in its electricity distribution system because we're locked into the system with 70+ local distributors that can't modernize. They don't have the capital. They're owned by municipal governments or Hydro One. They don't have the capital to go to where this whole system is going, smart grids, a whole bunch of things that we can get into. And so they're just locked. And people keep talking about, well, we ought to get this consolidated, but no one can move. A whole set of impediments to that. And we said, well, even if you didn't need the money, we would do something in this area. And that's important. This is good energy policy. This is going to produce better energy infrastructure. And what we want to do is use the two instruments that Hydro One owns, its own distribution system, and Brampton One, as catalysts to cause the kind of consolidation that everyone in the industry argues has to happen, and to bring in private capital and entrepreneurship to help drive that. All in, when you put the package together, what does it mean that we think we can do is when you do all this, even with the government retaining 40 to 45% interest in the distribution entities, you would free up $2 to $3 billion that you could spend on transit and transportation infrastructure, and you would be able to do that without increasing the debt and without increasing the deficit. So not a huge thing, doesn't revolutionize the world, but takes one step forward. And I'll pause then. Yeah.